ago, God made a promise. God made a promise to Abraham that God would be with Abraham and would make of him a great nation, would give him a land flowing with milk and honey, that he would have descendants that would outnumber the stars, and that through him and his family, they would become a blessing to the world. This was a big promise because at the time, Abraham had no children and he had no land. But as we heard a few weeks ago, God is faithful. And so in time, Abraham did have children. He had a son Ishmael with Hagar, and he had a son named Isaac with Sarah. Isaac went on to have 2 children. We heard about this a couple weeks ago too. He had Esau and then Jacob. And Jacob and his wives went on to have many children, including 12 sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of those sons was Joseph. And Joseph was the favorite of Jacob. Parents don't have favorites, but in this case, Joseph was the favorite. And Joseph's brothers didn't like that. And so one day, they played a trick on Joseph, and they sold him off to slavery in Egypt. But God was with Joseph. And so Joseph rose in the ranks of the Egyptian court and Pharaoh's court, and he eventually became a great leader there. And a few years later, when there was a huge famine in Egypt, Joseph helped. His smart actions saved all of the Egyptians, and it saved the Hebrew people who came to live in Egypt and escape the famine. And so already that promise of being a blessing to the whole world was coming true. Well, times changed. Joseph died, the pharaohs died, and generations passed. And pretty soon, the pharaohs that came to power forgot about Joseph, and they forgot about the good work that he had done for the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Egyptians looked around and saw all these Hebrew people that were still in their land. They saw them as foreigners and began to fear them. And so they decided to make them slaves. And they forced them into slave labor, making bricks and mortar for all the buildings in Egypt. So God began to look for another leader who would help bring those Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. Let us listen to the word of God.
Moses should have known it was coming. He had been marked for service to God ever since the day he was born. Born in a time of deep fear and division, Moses would have died if had not several people, Hebrew midwives, and Moses' mother and sister worked together to make sure Moses was safe. As a baby, they placed him in a basket and floated him down a river where he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised as an Egyptian and in Pharaoh's household, but nursed by his own Hebrew mother. A child of 2 worlds, as he grew older, he became more aware of the differences between Hebrews and Egyptians, especially as he witnessed the ways in which Egyptians mistreated the Hebrews living in Egypt. One day, Moses broke up a fight between an Egyptian slave driver and a Hebrew slave. Moses was trying to protect the Hebrew but ended up killing the Egyptian. Forced to run away to avoid the anger of the Pharaoh, Moses fled to a new place called Midian. In Midian, Moses began a new life. He got a new job, got married, and had a child. Moses became a shepherd and was put in charge of his father-in-law's flock of sheep.
I love sheep.
But while Moses was leading his new life, the Hebrews were still enslaved in Egypt. They cried out to God. God heard their cry and remembered God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God would make of them a great nation and that God would always be with them. One day, Moses led his flock to Horeb, the mountain of God, where much to his surprise, he saw a bush on fire. Moses hurried over to the bush, but then he realized the flames are not growing larger. He was confused. How could the bush be on fire and yet not burn up?
Whoa, that's weird.
Moses was about to move in closer to inspect the bush more carefully when a voice stopped him in his tracks. Moses! Moses! It was the voice of God.
Here I am.
The voice spoke again. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground.
And that is exactly what Moses did.
I am the God of your fathers and mothers, the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Isaiah and Rebekah, the God of Jacob and Leah.
You are my one true God.
God then went on to tell Moses of the bad situation back in Egypt.
I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them cry out in pain. I know their sufferings and have come to deliver them from the Egyptians.
Oh no, it sounds as if things have gotten worse since I left.
The people are crying out to me. I have promised to bring my people to a new land, a good land flowing with milk and honey.
What a wonderful promise.
Moses, you will fulfill this promise. You will lead my people to the promised land of milk and honey.
Oh, of course, God, you can do anything you... Wait a minute, me?
Yes, you. It is time, Moses. Time for you to return to Egypt. Time for you to see Pharaoh again and convince him to set my people free.
I am not good enough to do this good deed.
You are my choice.
But I'm afraid.
I will be with you.
But what if they don't listen to me?
I will be there to help you.
But I'm not a great speaker.
I will give you the words.
Please send somebody else.
You are my choice. There will be others around to support you, like your brother Aaron. But now I will always be with you, Moses.
Okay, God, I'll do what you say.
So Moses listened to God, and God was with him. With God's help, Moses became a great leader, and he led the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt.
This morning we hear one of the most famous scriptures from our Hebrew scripture, the story of Moses and the burning bush, and the call of Moses. And you heard at the very beginning of that story that Moses was one of the Hebrew people. And so, did any of you guys hear at the beginning of the skit? Come on up, you guys. Yeah, what was happening to the Hebrew people at that time? Did any of you guys hear what was happening? What was happening to the Hebrew people? Remember, John held up a sign. They were all cried out. Yeah, Sasha. They were enslaved. Yeah, what does it mean to be a slave? You work for your own people, you don't have what? Your own choices, yes. And often you don't get paid, right? So the people are really treated unfairly as enslaved. And so in this case, they were those Hebrew people started crying out to God, and God heard their voices. And one of the reasons that we tell these stories from our scripture is that there are still, even though these stories happened a long time ago, there's still parts of these stories that are true. And so even though there aren't Hebrew people enslaved in Egypt in the same way today, there are lots of people in our world who are treated unfairly today. There are a lot of people who are crying out for God's help and who are in pain. Can you guys think of anybody in our world that might be crying out right now? Yeah. Immigrants. Yeah. Refugees. Yeah. Who else? Adults you can speak to. Who else is in pain or crying out today?
People of color.
People of color.
Palestinians.
Palestinians.
Dreamers.
Dreamers? You said? Yeah.
People in poverty.
People in poverty. Rohingya. Yeah. Okay, sure. Politically, lots of people are crying out for different reasons. Yeah, homeless. Yeah, people in the LGBTQ community. Yeah, so there's all kinds of people that are still crying out because they're hurting today. And one of the things that the story tells us is that any time that God always hears the cries of these people. But when God does, God raises up leaders and helpers to help these folks. And so in our story this morning, we heard about God raising up Moses. And in the story, a wild thing happened to Moses, right? He was a shepherd. He was walking along one day, and then he turned around and he saw a burning bush. What would you guys do if you saw a burning bush? Run? Yeah. Put some water on it, get a hose. Yeah, it was definitely probably a little scary for Moses to stop and to see this burning bush. And I'm just curious, have any adults here or any of you ever seen a burning bush? Anybody? You, John? Yeah?
There's a burning bush in Sinai.
Oh, really? Like a literal burning bush? Oh, wow. Okay. So talk to John to see. But most of us don't have these like extreme calls, or that God comes to us in the form of a burning bush. Sometimes it comes in other ways, that God will speak to us or invite us to help. Sometimes it comes as we talk to other people, and as we're talking, something in us tells us to do something. Sometimes, I know for me, sometimes I get a gut feeling that I learn about something and I think, oh, I should help. Other people have dreams where God kind of works on us and invites us to think about how we can help other people. Are there other ways that you all have that God has spoken to you? Anybody here? Adults or kids? Other ways that we get our calls?
Through animals.
Through animals? Yeah.
Sometimes I hear it when I hear many different people say it another way. I think, wow, you can't let that go.
Yeah. So if you hear the voices of many people. Yeah. Through music? Yeah, that's a wonderful way that God speaks to us. And so what's great about this is that God speaks to all of us in different ways and calls us all in different ways. Now, in this story, Moses heard the call. God said, I need your help. I need you to help me come help the people in Hebrew who are enslaved. And how did Moses respond? Do you guys remember? What was his first response? He can't do it, right? He's not good enough. He was saying he doesn't speak very well, that he had all these reasons, and God kept saying, yeah, excuses. And God kept saying, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to help you, and there'll be other people around you to help you. And so sometimes when, I don't know if you guys ever feel this way, but when we get called to help somebody else, or called to do something new, sometimes it's a little scary, and we want to resist and kind of say, no, we can't do that. But God is there to help us, and we have a community around us that can help us make a difference. And I've been thinking a lot about this. Some of you probably know and saw about Greta Thunberg. You guys know her, the 16-year-old Swedish girl. She's the one that's been leading the actions for climate change. And she's really interesting because she also was very young and when she got this call to do something. And what you may not know is she also has Asperger's, a form of autism that one of the ways it manifests for her is it sometimes gives her a lot of social anxiety and she's afraid to speak or doesn't speak. And yet, in the midst of that, God has still called her and used her to speak on these global platforms at the UN Climate Action Summit to speak and speak up for change. And so God is there equipping her, even when she feels afraid or feels like she can't do it. And I think about even closer to home, some of you have been to respond to racism, and last spring we heard some of the youth in the community share about their experiences. And I think of one, Maya Gordon, she's a senior at Lake Ridge High School, and shared about her experience being African American in the Lake Oswego schools. And she moved here with her family in 7th grade and has just had a really difficult time moving through our school system. And so as she has started to share her stories and her experiences, it's making an impact in our schools. It's changing the way we understand and act for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she's now one of the co-chairs of the school district's diversity, equity, and inclusion team, and really among many other youth working for change. And so when we think about these folks, I mean, God can use all of us in really different ways. God gives us all particular experiences and gifts that God then invites us to use and be helpers to the world. And so what we're going to do now is just take a minute and think for ourselves about how God is using us or wants to use us in the world. And so in your bulletin, there are three questions. I'm going to give you some instructions, and then we're going to do this. There's 3 questions for you to think about. What is an issue that you are passionate about? Or another way to think about it is, who is someone or a group whose cries you hear? The second question is, well, I should say there, you can think about big things like immigrants and people of color, big groups of people, or you could think about just someone in particular, somebody you know who might just be hurting or crying out, an individual. Then what gifts have you been given to help? So are there particular skills that you have, experiences that you have, or a particular way that God might be calling you to respond or to act, whether that's speaking up, as Greta has done, or sharing experiences, as Maya has done, or maybe it's a very concrete skill, like you can build things or bake things or help someone who might need that. And then finally, what action can you take in the week or month ahead to reach out in faith? And to really think about what's one concrete action that we can do. And this is part of our goal as a church, as we use this metaphor of a tree, that we cultivate our roots, we build our roots, we nurture our trunk, our community. But this year we're really focusing on how do we reach out in faith. So what are the ways that God is calling us to take action in the world? So I'm going to invite you to take about 4 minutes or so to ponder this. On the end of each of your pews is a basket that looks like this, that has some hands and some pens. And so as you reflect, I'm going to invite you just to write down the action that you would like to take in the month or the week ahead. And then we'll collect those, and we're going to use them in just a minute to build a burning bush. So right now we're just going to take about 4 minutes for you guys to reflect individually. Kids, you guys can stay up here, and I'll give you hands, and we can talk about this together. And then I'll bring us back in just a few minutes. I love this. We're just, when you think about it, one of the things that sometimes is overwhelming is that there are so many cries from so many different people, and yet we all are taking action in our own ways. And here we heard about just even different groups, different people, and when each of us does something, it makes a really huge difference when we all do our own things and when we work together as a church. And it just reminds me of the book I read earlier this year, The Time Is Now, by Joan Chittister, where she talks about how it is so overwhelming, but if we don't have to do it all, but if we can do just one thing and take one step. And so thank you for these commitments that you have made and commitments that we will continue to live into. At this time,